Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, which is entitled Sleeping on the Job, Managing Sleep and Shift Work. This webinar is part of the Focus on Wellbeing program, which is linked to the National Wellbeing Hub. My name is Ray D'Souza. I'm the National Advisor for Workforce Wellbeing at Scottish Government and responsible for both this program and the National Wellbeing Hub. I am pleased to say that we've yet again managed to entice Dimitri to come and share his experience and lead this webinar for us. You'll see, I don't want to spend too long introducing Dimitri because he has run previous webinars for us, very well received, and it's by that, if I use the term popular demand, that Dimitri is back, simply because clearly it's an issue, both sleep and fatigue and anxiety and related issues are clearly a big issue for the workforce and colleagues in a variety of settings at the moment. And this is a topic that we've been particularly asked to address, and so I'm pleased that Dimitri has agreed to run this webinar for us. You'll see that from the program that I hope you've had and looked at, Dimitri is a clinical psychologist and sleep medicine specialist, and works on and runs the online program in sleep medicine in Oxford. He's also a clinical engagement lead for Sleepio at Big Health, which run both Big Sleep has produced two digital mental health apps, one called Sleepio, as outlined in the program, and the other one is called Daylight. Both are available on the National Wellbeing Hub. So without further ado, Dimitri, can I hand over to you, and thank you for running this session for us.
Thanks, Ray. Lovely to be here, and thanks for asking me to come back and talk about sleep, which is what I love doing. Much to the chagrin of my wife, I think, who thinks it would be nice to talk about something else in our house. But anyway, pleasure to be here. So I'm going to just put some slides up, and I think we can just skip through the introductions. But hi, everyone, I'm Dimitri. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training and a sleep medicine specialist now. So I see both adults and children with sleep disorders. I work clinically at the local trusts at Oxford University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, where I run a non-respiratory sleep disorder service, and I work part-time for the University of Oxford, where I lecture in sleep medicine, and part-time for Big Health, where I work kind of in clinician-to-clinician liaison around sleep and sleep treatment through Sleepio. So that's me. Lovely to be here. Thanks again for having me. And Scott, next slide, please. There we go. So I'm going to kind of start by illustrating what we're talking about through the example of Annie. So Annie is 34. She's a registered nurse and she works in a busy ward in a large general hospital. She works a pattern of shifts that includes earlies, lates and nights, and she has two daughters now aged 5 and 9, and her husband, who's an accountant, works locally. So she's a mother, she's a wife, and she's a clinician, and she tries her best to manage her responsibilities to her family and to her patients, but she's really struggling to maintain the balance at the moment. Annie's an early bird, so she finds early shifts pretty straightforward, but she doesn't do well when she's got nights or lates. But when she comes home after a night shift, she managed to grab a few hours straight away and then tends to wake mid-morning tired. She potters about in the middle of the day doing household bits and pieces, and then she has to do the school run. So she often tries to grab a nap in the afternoon, but it's really difficult with the kids at home, and they try to eat an early dinner together as a family so that they can see each other. On days when she's on lates and nights, she really struggles to stay alert, often using plenty of caffeine to help her get through it. So there may be some Annies out there in the audience, but I'm sure if you're a clinician working in the NHS, you'll have met someone like Annie, or you'll know someone like Annie, or you'll have some experience of what Annie's talking about here. If we can go to the next slide, please, Scott. Annie's trying to balance lots of different things. So on the one hand, she's trying to balance her own sleep needs. She's trying her best to get the sleep that she needs to function as a human being. She's also trying to balance staying alert and awake on shift. She has to be fully with it to look after her patients, to do what needs to be done as a nurse. And so she often uses things like coffee as a means of getting through points when she's very, very tired. And she's trying to balance the needs she has as a mum and as a partner to her husband and as a mum to her kids, doing all the things that mums and dads do. Often lots of mums, doing extra bits that, certainly we see that society quite a lot too. So balancing all these three things is interesting because they don't all work with each other, right? I've got 2 kids and I know that my children frequently disrupt my sleep. Okay, that's their prerogative as my daughters. They can get up in the morning and say, "Daddy, come downstairs." I know that I have to sometimes work late, and that might be something that means I don't get as much sleep that night. And I know I have to stay awake during the day to do my job too. And I'm not working shifts. Okay, so I'm also noticing that these are 3 things that I have to kind of balance too. We all have to balance to some degree. But in Annie's case, she's having to do so with a kind of a heightened level of pressure. Next slide, please, Scott. So for those of you who get the reference in the title, it's good for lots of things, not absolutely nothing. Sleep is really important, okay? Sleep is something that isn't associated with just one function. So when we think about why we sleep, really there's this kind of notion that we sleep really to rest, because actually all we need to do is just to recuperate after a long day and then get up feeling refreshed. But actually that hypothesis is now not something that we subscribe to anymore. We know that sleep is associated with a real range of different things that include things like, in importance in the dealing with or the cleansing of metabolic waste from the brain through things like the lymphatic system. We know that sleep is crucial for memory and learning. This is why staying up, cramming the night before an exam is not the best way to get a good result the next day. The best thing to do is to study and allow that to be encoded across the night. It's important in terms of things like protein synthesis, cell generation, in terms of the immune system, in terms of how it regulates different areas of our body, different processes in our body, the relationship it has with them. It's important for mental health. It's important for mood regulation, etc., and for things like attention. So sleep has a crucial and fundamental role in terms of us living as humans optimally. All right. So this is kind of what's it good for? It's good for absolutely everything. Scott, next slide, please. So if you think about what sleep looks like, I know we've drifted away from talking about Annie, but we'll get back to Annie in a bit. This is the kind of setting the scene. If you click through, we've got some animations here, Scott. We've got different stages of sleep. Okay, so we start being awake, and as we drift off from sleep, we go into the next stage, which is what we call stage 1 sleep, non-REM stage 1 sleep. That's the sleep that you see people entering into on the night bus on the way home from the pub when they do that, nodding off on the night bus. That's entering stage 1 sleep. So we all have that light stage of sleep as we go into sleep. Next stage is stage 2, where we spend most of our night, most of us. And the deepest stage of sleep, which is what we call non-REM stage 3 sleep, or slow wave sleep, that you can see is predominant in the first third of the sleep period. So that the first 3 hours maybe is where we get all our deep sleep. So when your wearable device tells you that you're not getting enough deep sleep in the early morning, it would be unusual to get deep sleep in the early morning. You don't get that at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. You get that when you go to bed initially. But it's important to understand that this is what sleep looks like, right? Deep sleep at the beginning, and then punctuated by periods of REM sleep, which is the next click, please, Scott. And you get these cycles of sleep where you go down into deep sleep, up into lighter sleep, bit of REM, down into deep sleep, up into lighter sleep, bit more REM, and then again cycles throughout the night. In adulthood, typically around 90 minutes, something like that. but we might wake up briefly after a cycle. So when we get to the second cycle there, you can see this person has woken up. This is a generic hypnogram, not a real person, but you can see they've woken up briefly. And waking up briefly after a sleep cycle is not pathological. It's not a sign of anything wrong. It's not a sign of insomnia. We all wake briefly throughout the night, but we go to sleep again. We just go back to sleep. We maybe don't even notice that we've woken up. And some people, if you ask them, did you wake up last night? They say, oh, I didn't wake up at all. I slept through completely. They won't remember that they woke up probably very briefly at several points. But that's important because when it's all dark, when it's in the middle of the night, when we're sleeping well, and what we have is that little brief awakening. That brief awakening isn't encoded because there's nothing important happening. The environment hasn't changed. We're still sleeping. It's still nighttime. We haven't got any stress or anything to deal with, so we go back to sleep. People with insomnia might experience some stress associated with the waking, and that might keep them awake a little bit longer, for instance. But by and large, those with good sleep experience this kind of a pattern. Okay, so next slide, please, Scott. So again, we have the brief awakenings. So if you scroll through the whole thing here, Scott, because we've got some animations here, but what we have on the bottom here is a day. So we have 6 o'clock in the morning, midnight, 6 o'clock in the morning the next day. And the first period is your wake period. So if you can stop here for a second, Scott, as you gradually go through the day, what you do is you increase what we call sleep pressure or your sleep drive. The longer you stay awake, the more likely it is that you will fall asleep. That's the basic equation. So this sleep pressure is something that builds as a result of wakefulness. It's what Colin Espy, my mentor and boss here in Oxford, calls you kind of debt that you owe to sleep, right? That what you have to pay the sleep banker. And of course, if you click next, Scott, then across the night, that sleep pressure dissipates. So once you go to sleep, you're allowed to release that sleep pressure again. And once that sleep pressure is gone, you wake up feeling refreshed. That's the idea, essentially. So build up that sleep pressure during the day, you release it throughout the night. That's what we call, that's the first process, or that's the sleep drive, the sleep process. The next process is something we call the circadian process. And if you click the next one, Scott, it's what we often call the circadian rhythm. So if you click through the next few, Scott, what we see is that across the day, you build alertness, and that alertness in a circadian sense is kind of optimal function. So you're thinking clearly, you're alert, you're awake, you feel awake, and you're kind of, even your physiological function is optimized at that point. And you can keep clicking through, and then as you get to the end of the day, you can see that it starts to wane, it starts to get lower, before getting very low until it reaches kind of its what we call its nadir, the lowest point, a couple of hours before you wake up naturally. And you see that actually these two things map onto each other quite nicely. As you build sleep pressure throughout the day, that alertness keeps you awake and stops you falling asleep because you're still building sleep pressure. So I'm building sleep pressure right now, and I've been awake since 6 o'clock this morning. So I'm pretty tired, but actually my circadian process is keeping me awake. And across the rest of the day, the circadian process will gradually tail off, and the sleep pressure will gradually keep going. And eventually, about maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock, I'll have a big difference between my sleep pressure and my circadian rhythm, which will be low, the alertness. And so that means I can fall asleep because the sleep pressure is high, the circadian alertness is low, and across the night, then the circadian alertness remains low and allows me to sleep. Next slide, please. So these are the two processes by which sleep is regulated. So if we think about how that then plays out in terms of what we call the body clock, every morning when we wake up, there's a special layer of cells in the back of the eye, in the retina, called photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. And these cells, unlike rods and cones, which you'll be aware of, these particular cells take in the wavelength of light. They get a sense of what color the light is in terms of on the wavelength, and they pass that information on to the master clock. So this is the main what we call this the master clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, and that clock is what then sets the timing for the rest of the body. So every cell in your body has an oscillation, a 24-hour oscillation in terms of its rhythm, but that's all centralized in terms of its timing by the SCN, and that is synced with the outside world through the eye. And so you wake up, information about the fact that it's morning, hits the eye, hits the SCN, that's then passed on to the body. And so the clock is kept in time every day by this syncing with the outside world, if you like, right? We also have then lots of things that change throughout the day in terms of our physiology that are controlled by the circadian rhythm, or at least driven by the circadian rhythm. So you can see that on the right hand side here, core body temperature drops significantly overnight. So when you fall asleep, your core body temperature drops, and this is as part of the circadian process. And you can see that your cortisol level also is dropping towards the end of the day and is low as you go through the night, gradually picking up before you get up in the morning. And your melatonin, which is a hormone secreted by the pineal gland associated with sleep, it peaks in the middle of the night. Okay, and so actually what we know is that bright light suppresses the secretion of melatonin, right, which is this sleep hormone. But lots of these other functions, things like your core body temperature, things like blood pressure, things change across the course of the night in line with the circadian process, because the body has evolved to not be active and do things during the night when we're sleeping, and so it's adapted to that in various ways. So we have these tangible differences in how we feel and what we do in terms of our physiological processes that happen at different times of the day, that's governed by this relationship we have with the outside world, mediated through the eye and getting light in through the eye, etc. So of course, if we're sleeping during that period, that's fine, but Annie's not sleeping, Annie's working sometimes. And so all these things are happening when actually she's needing to be active, she's needing to be engaged, she's needing to be alert. Next slide, please, Scott. So Annie's sleep looks a bit like this, right? So that's her circadian profile. So if you can just skip through the animation, Scott. What we have here is her sleep periods. She's going home and she's falling asleep pretty quickly, right? So she's falling asleep at pretty much straight away. But then because that alertness is peaking in the middle of the day, what happens is that alertness wakes her up. So what she gets is not the entirety of her sleep pressure isn't dissipated. She doesn't get rid of all that sleep pressure that she's built up. So remember, she's got a lot of sleep pressure. She's been awake for a longer period. When people go on to nights, as many people know, often they stay awake for a much longer period initially. They may be awake for a day and a half, as it were, for that first night, because actually they don't get a block of sleep directly before they go into work for the first shift. So they've got an extra long, an extra high sleep pressure, but it doesn't always get released entirely, because as you can see here, Annie's being woken by not only by her internal physiology, where the alertness signal is strong in the middle of the day, but also probably because she's got noises from the outside world, because she's got people calling on the house phone, because she's got people disturbing her. And unlike at night, she has a very active environment in which to sleep, which is not helpful for someone. So what instead then happens is she's awake. And so her sleep pressure gradually increases again, and it comes back up to a very high level. So even though she's working at night, you can see on the far right hand side here, she's working across the night, so her sleep pressure is still accruing across the night period, but her circadian alertness is also very low, so she doesn't get that that boost of alertness that she would have got otherwise. And so her cognitive function may be a bit off, her alertness might be a bit off. And so what does she do? She drinks coffee. Now, coffee is the single most, or caffeine, probably coffee, but caffeine for sure, the molecule, is the single most widely used stimulant in the world. It's used across the planet in various forms. And one of the things it does is it's an antagonist for adenosine. Adenosine is a metabolic byproduct that's associated with sleep pressure. So it kind of is a sleep pressure blocker, if you like, and it doesn't get rid of the sleep pressure. It doesn't make you feel refreshed. What it does is it puts a pin in it and says, right, you're not going to feel this for a while, until of course you metabolize your caffeine, after which you get a crash, because the brain there is a lot of adenosine here. I'm still very sleepy, right? So it's not something that gets rid of your sleepiness. It just puts it off for a bit. You don't feel it for a little while, because it sort of stops it having an effect. So Annie's sleep is very different from how it would be if we kind of went back to the other slide, which we won't do, Scott, but you can see the difference there. The sleep pressure looks very different, and her sleep period is much, much shorter. So she might get another sleep period. She might get another sleep period in about, maybe early evening or before she goes into her shift, if she's lucky, right? Because her sleep pressures are getting higher and her circadian rhythm's coming down, her alertness is coming down. But the likelihood is she's got other stuff to do, and so she hasn't got time to sleep then. So if we can jump onto the next slide, please. So when people experience shift problems or sleep problems related to shift work, such as what Annie's got going on for her, what tends to happen is when they go back to sleeping in a normal way, as in when they go back to that first model that I showed, sleep tends to kind of become normal again. It normalizes. Once the circadian misalignment, which is what we're talking about, that the fact that we're not synced with the world around us in the right way, once that's been rectified, sleep comes back to normal. But for lots of people who have to do this jumping around quite regularly, even when that circadian misalignment has kind of been rectified in a kind of in an explicit way, implicitly they still experience problems with their sleep. And so many people develop what we know as shift work sleep disorder, where during the time that they are trying to sleep, they experience insomnia, and during the time when they're trying to be awake, they experience what we call excessive daytime sleepiness, which is this kind of all-pervasive sleepiness that causes them to feel awful. It's often made much worse by patterns that are constantly shifting. So if you're someone who's a night shift worker and you adapt to working a night shift, and you stick with that, and that's consistent across the board, that might be better for you than something that's constantly changing. But with Annie's case, she chops and changes her shifts according to what she's got to do. She can choose her rota. She can get involved with directing it, and she's trying her best to manage all those different things. As I said, there's 3 different things to balance at the same time. So she's being directed by what's going on around her. The trouble is, when you experience that kind of a problem with your sleep in a chronic fashion, as with shift work sleep disorder, you're at a higher risk of physical and mental health problems. And so Annie's already on the back foot here. Also, when she's in work, she's also kind of at risk of making mistakes at work. She may have accidents. There are certainly increased incidences of work-related injuries in people who are working shifts like that. And something that I think is really important to acknowledge with the current audience is that healthcare workers not only have to endure that kind of shift work chopping and changing all the time, but they also then have to deal with extreme stress on top of that shift work changing pattern, right? So they have to deal with emergencies, they have to deal with difficult social interactions with patients, and so on and so forth. And so not only do they have that baseline level of disruption, they've also got this other thing to deal with too. So it's not surprising that it's immensely difficult for lots of people working shifts within the health service. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of things that I've taken from a review here, looking at risk factors for shift work problems. If you could just scroll through them all, Scott, that would be great. But older people are at a higher risk of problems with shift work. Older age is associated with what we call an advance in circadian phase. So actually older age is associated with going to bed earlier rather than going to bed later. We go to bed later and later until we hit sort of our young adulthood, early adulthood, adolescence, and then we start coming back again, and we get earlier and earlier throughout our lives until we get to older age, where we become generally quite early again. People who are morning types, as in they have an early circadian pattern, and what that means is that yellow part of the graph that we saw earlier, where we have the circadian alertness, that's just shifted a bit earlier. And what that means is that peak that we saw might just happen earlier for some people. I'm not a morning type particularly. I think I'm probably in the middle somewhere. Most of us tend to be in the middle somewhere, but I'm a bit earlier than I am later. right? My wife's a bit later than she is earlier, and so we're kind of in the middle, but on opposite sides maybe of that average. The reality is that very, very early people do exist. People who get up very early, 5 in the morning, that's when they get up, through 4 in the morning maybe, and they go to bed at maybe 7 or 8 in the evening. And you get the opposite too, where you get later people who go to bed, like lots of teenagers, for example, going to bed at say 2 or 3 in the morning, and then waking up naturally at about 11 or 12 or something. And so these are extremes in terms of what we call chronotypes. But people who are earlier types tend to have more problems with shift work than people who are later types. People who have what we call lower circadian flexibility, this ability to jump across and become a little bit later or become a bit earlier, also at a higher risk of developing problems with shift work. That would be associated as well with being younger. So being able to move it a bit in younger adulthood, maybe, or say middle adulthood, is probably a little bit more flexible. As you get into older adulthood, as I said, you become earlier, and so your flexibility is probably also compromised. And then we have things like having families. Now, as a father myself, as a husband myself, I know that my responsibilities to my wife and children also kind of impact me as a worker, as someone who has to manage my own work time. And never has that been more explicit than during the pandemic, when we've had to do all kinds of things like home working and looking after young people and children whilst we try and work at the same time. But these make it even more difficult for people with shift work patterns, and compound the problem, as we can see with Annie. Annie wants to try and make sure that she has dinner with her kids every night, but of course what that means is she has to forego that nap before going into work, so she gets even less sleep. Of course, people who use caffeine are going to struggle with sleep to some degree when it comes to trying to get to sleep if they're having a lot of caffeine, because caffeine, as I said before, it masks sleep, or masks sleepiness. So it masks that sleep pressure that we build up during wakefulness. And of course, if you're drinking it quite a lot during a period when you're trying to stay awake, it does hang around in the bloodstream. The half-life of caffeine in adults tends to be between about 3 and 7 hours on average. So 3 and 7 hours is quite a long time. Let's say, worst case scenario, 7 hours later, or let's say 6 hours later, if you have your last cup of coffee just before you end your shift at say 4 in the morning, right? You've still got half that cup of coffee going around your bloodstream, and you probably had more throughout the night as well. It's going to stop you falling asleep when you get home. And it's not your fault that you're drinking coffee to stay awake, but the point here is that doing so precludes you being able to fall asleep and stay asleep, because it hangs around in the bloodstream for a long time. It also disrupts sleep even when you do manage to get to sleep. So caffeine will change the architecture of sleep. It changes the way it happens once you do get to sleep too. So the various kind of risk factors. Thanks, Scott. Next slide, please. So if you could just jump through the animations again, that'd be great. But we talked about chronotypes again. So on the one hand, we have what we call early birds. Larks, morning larks. And as I said, I'm not one. Unfortunately, at the moment, my 11-month-old is, but that's her prerogative to make sure her dad does the best he can. But the point here is that people who are early birds have a natural predisposition, genetic predisposition to getting up early and going to sleep early. These people are unsurprisingly more likely to find earlier shifts easier to manage than people who are later types. But they're also conversely going to find later shifts much more difficult to manage than someone who's a later type. Then you have people in the middle. I'm not sure what that bird is in the middle, but I found the picture and rather liked it. It's an indeterminate bird, all right? And that indeterminate bird, or that intermediate bird, doesn't have a huge amount of difficulty with either if it has to move itself one way or the other. But then again, it has its own space as well. So the point here is that we all exist within our own chronotype. These night owls may find night shifts easier to manage than earlier people, but they're going to find early shifts really difficult to manage because they naturally go to bed very late and they naturally get up quite late. So it's worth thinking yourself about where you might fit. And there are questionnaires you can do. One questionnaire which is very interesting is called the Morningness Eveningness Questionnaire, or the Hoorn-Osberg questionnaire. I think it's 1976 that it was developed, but it's something that people can do, and you can find it online, the morningness, eveningness questionnaire, that allows you to get a sense of where your chronotype might be, just as a bit of personal kind of investigation. Thanks, Scott. So there are a couple of considerations that we might want to think about with shift workers. And when I talk to shift workers, I have to be really frank to begin with and say, listen, first things first, if you're really struggling with shift work, is this really the right work pattern for you? I remember having a very frank discussion with someone. It's easy for me because I don't work shift work patterns at the moment. So it's easy for me to sit in this position and say this kind of stuff. But I think it's a fair question to ask. If this is really causing you a lot of problems, are there any alternatives? Is this something that you have to do? And maybe it requires a radical rethink, but actually maybe that's worth the price of your health, or your family relationships, or your mental health, or whatever it happens to be. It's also worth thinking about whether you have a rotating shift pattern or a regular shift pattern. It's easier to stick with something that you do regularly and to flex with that. So if you always do a late shift, that's okay. If you manage it in that way and that's your thing, right, you become used to it. That's probably easier for people than something that constantly changes. Because when it constantly changes, really your body never gets the opportunity to sink into a particular pattern. And as a result, you may find that more tricky. So that perpetual change is something you might want to watch out for if you notice that that's part of what you have to do day to day. It's also worth, again, coming back to the earlier slide, to stick with what you're set up to do and how you work. So if you're an earlier type, go for earlier shifts. If you're a later type, go for later ones, and try and stick within what you what you can manage in terms of your own genetic makeup, your own genetic setup. The final thing is just to say, when it comes to moving your sleep period, which is what we all have to do when we do a later shift, gradually moving it is something that's probably much more helpful than doing it abruptly. So what most people do is they stay awake, as I say, for that whole day, and then they go in and do the first night. So they don't get any sleep at all for a much longer period. So they're extremely tired during that first night, which is often when it's hardest. But if you gradually move your sleep by an hour or so every 24-hour period for a couple of days, you may find that gentle change makes it easier for you to manage that first night and then to make the transition again. Thanks, Scott. And you could do it with even less. It doesn't have to be an hour, it could be less than that. Thinking about staying alert whilst you're on the job is also really important. Coffee, as we've said already, has some real benefits to it in terms of keeping you awake. It's something that is a very effective stimulant, but it comes with the big cons too. And one of those big ones is that it hangs around your system for a long time, and it will affect the way you sleep when you get back home. So if you do want to use coffee, I would say limit it, or tea, limit it right to the start of your shift, or maybe even before you go in for your shift, but don't use it as much as you can as you go towards the end of the shift, or even from the middle, because what you're doing is you're setting yourself up for difficulty sleeping when you get back home again. Napping is a really helpful way of promoting alertness, and we have data from this, experimental data from this, showing that actually power napping, where possible, is something that is much better than having coffee in terms of promoting alertness. Now, in the NHS, that's tricky because you can get reprimanded for having a nap during your shift, right? But there are some trusts where things are starting to change. People are giving that there are restrooms and even nap pods available in some places for people to have naps. Now, it's very idiosyncratic. It's not something we can generalize very much, but it's a really good idea, particularly if you're driving home after a night shift, to see if you can have a power nap before you get in the car, or to do something to help you shake off any residual sleepiness before you get in the car, because that driving very tired is risky. But also maybe even having brief naps, if you can, very brief naps during the course of the shift, maybe one in the middle, just to help with alertness. As I say, that's not something that everyone can do, although some people are starting to do it in some trusts. The other thing you can think about is using light. So bright light has an alerting effect on the body. Bright light suppresses melatonin secretion, and it alerts us. If you can stay within bright areas, if the nursing station is bright and you can stand underneath the bright lights there, that may be more helpful than being in darker areas. Of course, you may have to do work in darker areas when patients are sleeping. But the idea is that using light is something that can help maintain alertness a bit. And there are various ways in which people are kind of investigating use of things like light goggles, where you can have glasses that shine light into your eyes to help with alertness. But bright light in the morning as you drive home might not be the most helpful thing. So if you can do so, one of the things you might want to try is wearing sunglasses as you drive home in the morning if it's a bright morning, because bright light will suppress the melatonin that will be important for you getting the sleep you need when you do eventually get into bed, and alert you as you get back home. So there's no kind of easy way of coming about it, but we have to understand the various factors involved in staying alert and how we can kind of manage them. Thanks, Scott. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, I forgot these have all got things. So yeah, use caffeine with caution. More than 30 minutes of nap time means you often enter deep sleep. So entering deep sleep is something that makes it more difficult to wake up, and often you experience severe grogginess when you woke up. So having a shorter nap is probably better than having a longer one. As I say, power naps, if you can, an effective way of staying alert, and thinking carefully about driving is important. Bright light during the shift helps alertness, but be careful when coming home, because bright light can be something that will affect being able to fall asleep when you do get home. Thanks, Scott. Next slide, please. So if you could just zip through the animations here. So one of the things we want to be really aware of is protecting sleep at home, making sure that sleep at home is, is as I say, protected and safe. It's important to nap in bed. And to make sure that the area, this may sound so obvious to people, but it's really interesting thinking about how it affects when you're at home, when children are at home, partners are at home, maybe friends are coming around or whatever. It's very easy for this all to start sliding. Protecting your bedroom and saying, right, this is where mum or dad or whomever, this is where I have my nap. If the big sign on the door, no one comes in, I've got my earplugs in, it's dark and I'm not going to get disturbed. The phone's away somewhere else, and people know that you're sleeping. Maybe you even put a sign up outside your door saying to the delivery drivers, please leave the stuff here behind the bins, rather than knocking on the door, because we all know that we're all getting deliveries now all day, every day, as a result of being kind of in lockdown. So thinking carefully about that. Maybe it's thinking about delegating pickups when it's your turn to sleep. Maybe it's thinking about asking friends to get involved with childcare if necessary, and arranging, so not only that, but also arranging opportunities for quality time with the kids where you're not on call, where you're not needing to catch up on your sleep. So maybe that's on the weekends when you say, right, we're going to go and do something fun, just us, and we make time for it, but we take the time from elsewhere. And also it might be the case that you want to make sure everyone knows where you are in terms of your schedules. So you create a diary. These are the times when you can come and see mummy. These are the times when you have to go and see daddy, etc., etc. And it makes it clear that people, can interact with you in certain periods, but don't interact with you elsewhere. Next slide, please, Scott. So when we think about what we do with the bedroom, you'll all be aware of this because this is basic sleep hygiene, but the idea is we want to maintain a cool, dark and a quiet sleeping space. That's where we've evolved to sleep. In the middle of the night, it's cool, it's dark and it's quiet. So you might want to use earplugs. I use earplugs anyway, very, very soft, squishy ones, and they go in there and they expand in my ears and they help just drown out the noise of my dog walking around on our floorboards at 3 in the morning, as she likes to do for some reason. But that's the kind of thing that'll just take the edge off listening to people going up and down the street beeping, delivery drivers, dogs, people walking and talking outside in the middle of the day, things that will disturb your sleep. Keeping the room cool is also important, especially during the summer. So the optimal temperature we tend to recommend is about 18 degrees. That might seem cold. Maybe it's a fan that you need to use to help keep the room cool, but something to help keep the room cool and maintain that cool temperature across the sleep period is going to be helpful. And reducing light through things like blackout blinds, because light, as we said, has this immensely stimulating effect and can really impact sleep, even if it's relatively, dim light coming in through the sides of the curtains. And even if you've got your eyes closed, it'll still penetrate your eyelids and it'll wake you up potentially. So being careful about these kinds of things. Next slide, please, Scott. And thinking carefully about winding down before sleep too. So often when we get back from a shift, it might be the case that you just want to jump into bed straight away, fully clothed, don't want to think about anything, just going to completely conk out, and fair play. But at the same time, it might also be helpful to wind down a bit before you get into bed, before you switch off. The idea being that you put yourself into a similar position that you would kind of experience if you're going to bed at night, gently winding down. Maybe it's you do a bit of relaxation before you go to bed. If you feel stressed, if you feel like you want to leave the working day somewhere else, I think that's a helpful thing to do. I remember, many times having come back off stressful days in clinic where I've had to actually take some time just to put things away in my mind and then come back to sleep. Things like writing down. So there's a great technique called putting the day to rest that we often advocate, where we say get a notebook, and then as you get home, or maybe it's a couple of hours before you go to bed, note down all the things you've got to remember for the next day. Anything that you know is knocking about up there that you don't want to forget. Put it all down nice and coherently, and maybe make some notes too. Right, I've got to call Scott. I've got to make sure I call him on this number because he hasn't got that anymore, and that's his new email address. And you put it all down. You be pedantic about it, because the more you put down on paper, the more you're getting out of your mind and onto the page. And then once you've done that, you can let that go. You don't need to come back to that. And you could always make an agreement with yourself and put a reminder on your phone that you're going to come back to this at whatever it is, 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. I'm going to come back and deal with this, but I'm not going to deal with it now, right? And so it's a fairly simple exercise, but it's something that we're doing as a means of trying to offset cognitive arousal before bed, which is something that stops us falling asleep and staying asleep. The other thing is also thinking about maybe relaxing in a more straightforward way. Maybe it's about having a wash, having a bath, something that I certainly like to do when I came back from a long day in clinic, just to help you kind of shake off the dust of the day. And one of the things people describe is anecdotal evidence only here, but having a bath can increase your internal temperature, your core temperature, and then as you get out of the bath, as you lose core temperature, that can help you feel sleepy, help you feel relaxed, which is something that some people find helpful before going to bed. But the idea is that you do what you find helpful, and in doing so, you allow yourself to go to sleep in a less frantic way. Thanks, Scott. So at Sleepio, we've got some what we call expert articles written by members of the team about things like shift work, about things like being a new parent and how that affects sleep, about being pregnant and sleep, sleep basics, jet lag, not that anyone's interested in that at the moment, but jet lag and how that affects sleep from a circadian perspective, and things like wearable device use, so things like Fitbits, etc. These articles are free for you to kind of browse, and we can put links into the chat, but it's sleepio.com/articles. And and of course the program itself, Sleepio, although not designed to target shift work, does have lots of things within it that are helpful for people who are struggling with their sleep as a result of shift work. Next slide, please, Scott. That's it. So NHS Scotland currently are providing therapeutics for insomnia and anxiety to all staff. For insomnia, we have Sleepio, and that's a 6-week, although it's 6 weekly therapy sessions, really, delivered through a computer with the prof who's there, and it's a tailored CBT for insomnia treatment. So it's a cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, tailored to your own sleep problem, delivered, as I say, through the internet, through this program that adapts to your sleep. There are 6 sessions across 6 weeks, and then you have access to the program for a year, in which there's also kind of a forum, opportunity to ask sleep experts questions and other users questions, and of course to read library articles and things that people might find helpful too. And we have a similar app called Daylight, which targets worry and anxiety. So Daylight has been developed by experts at King's College London and UCL, and it's essentially CBT techniques for anxiety. So it's much more sort of pick up and play than Sleepio is, and it's something that can be used on the phone very easily. So it includes things like progressive muscle relaxation, tense and release, and various other cognitive techniques that help people manage anxiety in the moment. So it's a useful kind of additional help or support for people with anxiety. Next slide, please, Scott. So that's it. That's me. I hope it's been helpful. I'm very happy to answer some questions if people have any, but thanks very much for listening. And thanks, Scott, for doing all the slides.
Dimitri, I have some questions that, from participants.
Yes, sure.
First one, if I could put to you, is from somebody who says, I feel self-conscious about my ability to cope with certain shifts compared to others in my team.
Yeah.
What you've just said helps me to realize that this may be due to my circadian rhythm.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that? I mean, is that somebody just obviously making sense of what you've just said?
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I'm really glad to hear that was where you came to. Scott, maybe if you could minimize the screen so we can use the camera a bit. Yeah, absolutely. That's great news that you found it helpful to kind of identify with that. We've entered an age now where we are quite rightly starting to acknowledge diversity in lots of different ways. And this is way overdue. We should be doing it. We should have been doing it a long time ago. But we're beginning to acknowledge diversity in terms of ethnicity, sexual preference, gender, neurodiversity. Diversity is a big thing, right? One of the areas that we're also beginning to think a little bit more about is things like chronodiversity, where your chronotype is. We live in a world that is predominantly a kind of a post-Victorian 9 to 5. Everyone has to work like crazy throughout the week and then kind of collapse on the weekends. Maybe that's not a very helpful way to live our lives. I was just talking about it with my wife earlier today. One of the things that's interesting is during lockdown, people who are later types who've been working from home have noticed that actually they can sleep in a little bit later because they don't have to catch the train into work or get the bus. And as a result, they've been sleeping more to their natural kind of frequency, if you like, their natural rhythm. And that's been helpful for them. Likewise, you've got younger people who have a similar sort of experience where they haven't had to go into school. So this is great that you're beginning to kind of acknowledge it. I think that the main thing to say is that, yeah, it's not your fault, and humans were not ever, quote unquote, designed by nature to deal with shift work. This is not how we've evolved. We've evolved to sleep during the night and to go out and gather and forage and hunt and do all kinds of other things during the day, but we haven't evolved to do the opposite. And so what we're working up against here is our natural biology, and working against biology can only work for so long before actually you start going, this is just, this is too much. So, I guess the other thing to say to the brave individual who reflected that thus in the question is that other people may be struggling too, but maybe less keen on sharing how much they're struggling. People are very good at pretending like everything's okay, and I think we're entering a time now where people are beginning to say, I'm going to be brave here and say I'm not feeling okay with it, and it's okay. It's okay to share that. In fact, that's one of the reasons why things like the National Wellbeing Hub is so important, being able to say this kind of stuff and share it. Sleep is a route into talking about mental health for so many people. So mental health is kind of stigmatized and shouldn't be, but it is. And sleep problems are much less so. So very often when I talk to people about their sleep, very often it leads to, and also I'm sort of feeling very anxious about this and my mood's low about that and so on and so forth. So yeah, Great. Great.
That actually leads it very nicely onto the next question in terms of the link with mental health. And this colleague says, I'm a carer and I work shift patterns. I suffer from mental health and also from fibromyalgia at night. I find it very hard to sleep, and then I'm tired all day. Even at night I'm tired, but I can't seem to drop off. Are there any methods or anything I can do that will help with this?
So a great question, and I'm sorry to hear things are so tricky at the moment. Fibromyalgia is a tricky one because things like fibromyalgia, things like CFS, ME, these are conditions that are associated with what we call unrefreshing sleep. Unrefreshing sleep is not insomnia, they're not the same thing. And it may be the case that even when people get sleep, they may experience it as being unrefreshing. But the idea is that these things are not, they don't exist as kind of independent silos in your life. Nothing that you experience in life, whether it's mood problems, whether it's anxiety, whether it's stress in a more generalistic sense, whether it's existential stress about the environment or about the political state of the country, whatever it is, none of this is happening in isolation. It's all gelling with the way you interact with people, with what you do in the evenings, with how you speak to your friends, with how you interact with your family, what food you eat, what exercise you do. It's all contained within you. This is the nature of the individual being complex. And so part of what's important is to think, are there areas in my life in which I'm not getting to do what I'd like to do? Do I want to be going out more? Do I want to be seeing friends more? Do I want to be doing more exercise? Those kinds of things are important to take into account too, in terms of living your life in the way in which you want to. Maybe getting help for the mental health problems that you've talked about to maybe form part of that. In terms of sleep we have to see as not being kind of isolated too. It's not just about, if I could get good sleep, everything else would be fine. It's about thinking, well, sleep is part of this picture, this complex picture of my life. If I'm not sleeping very well, how is that impacting what I'm doing during the day? How is the fact that I'm doing that during the day then impacting my sleep or lack of it or whatever? And so thinking in this way, I think, is the way in which I find it more helpful to think about problems as being all kind of part of the same thing, which is you. But in a practical sense, what can I advise? Well, giving Sleepio a go is probably a good place to start. Sleepio provides loads of information about sleep, but also loads of information about what happens when we don't sleep well and what we do as a result of not having slept well. So those kinds of things will be addressed by the program, and it's worth starting off there. But it sounds like a complex picture, and I think it would be pretty flippant of me just to say, well, I tell you what, go and do this and you'll be fine. The likelihood is it's a complex thing around which to work, but understanding the way in which nighttime things affect the day, daytime things affect the night, I think is a good place in which to start. I hope that's helpful. I'm not sure it was particularly, but
no, that is helpful in terms of Sleepio colleagues. I should say the Sleepio is available, as somebody's just asked in the chat box. It's available on the National Wellbeing Hub, and you access it through there. But Roxy asked a really interesting question, Dimitri, in terms of, is it helpful to aim towards a number of hours of sleep, for example, 7 or 8 at each 24-hour period when on night shifts, even in split sessions, sleep sessions?
Really, really good question, Roxy. Thank you for that. So one of the slides I didn't put into this one, we didn't have time to go through it, was a slide showing the ranges of total sleep duration across the age span that you see in human beings. So you may see very little babies, newborns sleeping for up to 19 hours a night, or in a 24-hour period, sorry. That's a huge amount, right? But you may also see them sleeping maybe only 14 hours in a 24-hour period. The range is huge. And that's just normal variation. If you look at adults of working age, so 40-year-old person like me, would be between 7 and 9 hours on average. But it may be that there are people who only need 6, and there may be people who need 10. The range is what we call the recommended range between 7 and 9, but there may be kind of these extra bits as well, depending on who you are. Your need is your need. And it may be the case that you need to kind of get a sense of that for yourself. Some people, it's a bit like saying, what shoe size should I have aged 40 as a man? Well, depends what your size of your feet are, right? So if you decide that you're going to go online and work out what my shoe size is by looking up on a chart, that's probably not a very helpful way to do it. The best way to do it is go and try some shoes on and work it out. But in the same sense, sleep is something that will be individual to you. So it may be that you need 8 hours, 8.5, maybe you need 7.5. It depends on, you know, if you had a bad night or the night before, you'll need a little bit more the next day. But that's not representative of your natural sleep need. That's just a kind of a knock-on effect of having had a poor night's sleep or not enough. So get an understanding, first thing, of what your need is, kind of during a period of rest, period of not maybe a period of holiday, and then also in terms of the split. This is a really good point that I neglected to talk about before. I tried to kind of get it in there with Annie's thing, but if you can't get it all in one block as a shift worker, get as much as you can to begin with, and then try and add up a little bit more at the end and that just before your shift, and together they may you know, kind of offset. The likelihood is you won't get what you need. Yeah? Even if you try to get it in 2 blocks, the likelihood is you won't get what you need, but you can certainly make up for as much of the deficit as you can by getting those 2 blocks. So it's a great idea to try and get 2 blocks if you can. But yeah, thanks for the.
It's interesting you say that, because somebody else in the chat box saying for long shifts plus a commute, meaning few hours at home, then you would usually spend asleep. Would you suggest prioritizing relaxation, wind down at the expense of extra minutes sleep?
I think we've got to prioritize sleep over everything when, and I don't mean to be flippant in answering the question, but I think we do need to prioritize sleep over everything, because the likelihood is if you're a shift worker, you're not going to get enough sleep. Shift workers don't get the kind of sleep that people who don't work shifts get. That's the problem. So we want to prioritize sleep, but at the same time, there's another thing to bear in mind too, and that's that if I come over to Ray and I say, right, Ray, off you go, go to sleep, Ray, go to sleep, quick, come on, go to sleep quickly. It's going to be unhelpful for Ray. Ray's not going to feel relaxed, and he's not going to fall asleep. He might do if he finds me very boring, which I'm sure he does. But the point is that this is not something that we can make happen quickly. So when you get home after and you think, right, I've got to get to sleep now, I've got to try and make sure I get as much sleep as possible, that agitation, that arousal that you experience as a result of the need to fall asleep will probably keep you awake, and that's not helpful. So getting some wind down in before then is probably helpful in terms of taking the edge off, but that's going to be something that's, you know, you make sense of by yourself. It's not something we can generalize hugely. The idea is that sleep effort, trying hard to fall asleep, putting pressure on yourself to fall asleep, that's unhelpful stuff.
It's probably an ideal opportunity to thank you for your participation and your questions, and we'll, as I've said before, the recording will be on the National Wellbeing Hub, and the details of Sleepio as well can be accessed by the National Wellbeing Hub. We will post out to you the link on the Wellbeing Hub for your interest or for your colleagues' interest, to pass on to your colleagues. Thank you once again, and do engage with the Focus on Wellbeing webinar program if you can, and other sessions if you can. Thanks a lot, and stay well. Bye bye.